Here is a question that doesn't get asked nearly enough. When the Nuremberg trials ended in 1946 and the world congratulated itself on delivering justice to the architects of the most catastrophic war in human history, who exactly was sitting in the courtroom dock? You had generals, you had propaganda ministers, you had SS commanders, you had doctors who conducted experiments on prisoners, you had men who gave the orders and men who pulled the triggers. But there was one category of person who was almost entirely absent from those proceedings. The financiers, the industrialists, the bankers, the men whose money made all of it possible, the men sitting in boardrooms in New York and London who looked at a broken, desperate Germany in the early 1920s and saw not a human tragedy, but a business opportunity. These men never faced a tribunal that mattered. They were never paraded before the cameras. They went home to their estates, their country clubs, their Senate seats, and in at least one case, the White House itself. This is the story that official history has worked very hard to bury. It is a story that cuts too close to the institutions and the dynasties that still shape the world today. It is a story that requires you to hold two uncomfortable thoughts at the same time: that American soldiers died fighting a regime that American money helped to build, and that the people responsible for funding that regime never spent a single night in a Nuremberg prison cell. It is a story about how ideology is almost always downstream of money, and about what happens when the people who control the money decide that the rules of civilization simply do not apply to them. To understand it fully, you have to go back to a specific moment in history. You have to go back to Germany in 1923, because the ground for everything that followed was prepared in those months of fire and chaos and paper money blowing through the streets like autumn leaves. Germany in 1923 was a country that had been destroyed twice over. The first destruction was the Great War itself, 4 years of industrial slaughter that killed nearly 2 million German soldiers and left the economy in ruins. The second destruction came in the form of the Treaty of Versailles, which in 1919 placed the entire blame for the war on Germany and demanded reparations that the Allied Reparations Commission eventually fixed at 132 billion gold marks. This was a figure so enormous, so deliberately punishing, that many serious economists at the time believed it was designed not to compensate the Allies, but to permanently cripple the German state. And one of the most vocal critics of the Versailles settlement was a young British economist named John Maynard Keynes, who resigned from the British delegation in protest and wrote a withering book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. He believed, correctly as it turned out, that crushing Germany with impossible debt would not secure peace. It would guarantee war. And so it began. Germany struggled to make its reparations payments. France and Belgium, impatient and furious, occupied the German industrial heartland of the Ruhr in January 1923, essentially seizing German factories and mines to extract by force what they could not obtain through diplomacy. The German government's response was to encourage passive resistance among Ruhr workers while printing money to pay their wages. The printing presses ran without stopping, and the result was one of the most spectacular economic catastrophes in modern history: hyperinflation. By November 1923, one American dollar was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. The currency had become so worthless that workers were paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before they lost their value. Children built towers out of banknotes because it was cheaper than buying toys. People burned stacks of money for heat because it cost less than firewood. The savings of the German middle class, the teachers, the lawyers, the civil servants, the shopkeepers who had spent their lives accumulating modest wealth, were obliterated overnight. That kind of humiliation does something to a society. It creates a rage that is looking for somewhere to land. It creates the precise psychological conditions in which extreme politics becomes possible. And this is where the story takes a turn that most history textbooks either skip over entirely or describe in a way that carefully obscures who was actually pulling the strings. In 1924, a committee of international financial experts, chaired by an American banker named Charles Gates Dawes, produced what became known as the Dawes Plan. On its surface, the plan appeared generous and pragmatic. It reduced Germany's immediate reparations burden, reorganized the Reichsbank under foreign supervision, and arranged for an initial loan of 800 million gold marks to help stabilize the German economy. It also, crucially, opened the American capital markets to Germany. Wall Street banks could now issue bonds on behalf of German corporations. American investors could pour money into the German industrial recovery, and pour it they did. Between 1924 and the Wall Street crash of 1929, more than 29 billion Reichsmarks in foreign loans flowed into Germany. Much of this came from the United States. Much of it was organized by the great Wall Street banking houses: J.P. Morgan, Dillon, Reed and Company, National City Bank. The money rebuilt German industry at a pace that astonished observers. Unemployment fell sharply, production soared. Germany entered a period of apparent prosperity that Germans called the Golden Twenties, and the international financial community congratulated itself on having solved the problem that the Treaty of Versailles had created. But Professor Anthony Sutton, a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, who spent decades digging through corporate records and government documents, arrived at a very different conclusion. The loans, he argued, were not primarily motivated by humanitarian concern for the German people or by enlightened self-interest in European stability. They were motivated by profit, and not just the ordinary kind of profit that comes from lending money at interest. They were motivated by the far larger profits that came from gaining controlling positions in the vast cartels that dominated German industry. The chemical companies, the steel mills, the electrical manufacturers, the oil refiners, at a time when those companies were desperate for capital and willing to offer extraordinarily favorable terms to anyone who could provide it. By 1933, according to Sutton's analysis, the key sectors of German industry and the major German banks were substantially under the influence of American financial capital. These were not passive investors. These were people with seats on supervisory boards, with their own managers installed in key positions, with detailed knowledge of the company's operations and plans. The American financial community had, in a very real sense, purchased a stake in the German industrial machine at the precise moment when that machine was about to be redirected toward rearmament and conquest. The most important of these industrial relationships, and the one that Sutton spent the most time documenting, was the connection between Wall Street and IG Farben. To understand what IG Farben was, you have to understand its scale. By 1932, it was the largest chemical conglomerate in the world. By 1939, it was the largest industrial group in all of Germany, with participating interests in 400 German firms and operations spanning every commercial center on the planet. It produced dyes and pharmaceuticals and explosives and synthetic rubber and synthetic gasoline. It was, in the words used at its post-war trial, the most notorious German industrial concern of the Third Reich. IG Farben had been assembled in its modern form in 1925, and the capital that made this possible came largely from Wall Street. The German bankers on the Farben Supervisory Board in the late 1920s were, in many cases, directors of cartels that had direct American ownership, American investment, or some formal business relationship with American financial institutions. Hermann Schmitz, who organized IG Farben in 1925 and later became chairman of its supervisory board, became a prominent early Nazi and supporter of Hitler. Schmitz's family origins, interestingly, traced back to New York rather than Germany. The Schacht family, referring here to Hjalmar Schacht, the man who would become Hitler's financial genius and his first Reichsbank president, had roots in a banking house that was controlled by the J.P. Morgan firm. IG Farben contributed 400,000 Reichsmarks to Hitler's political slush fund in 1933. It was this secret fund that financed the Nazi seizure of control in March 1933, the propaganda campaign, the intimidation of rivals, the consolidation of power. The money that helped Hitler become chancellor had passed through hands that were connected, through a web of board memberships and corporate relationships, to some of the most respected financial institutions on Wall Street. And then there was American IG Chemical Corporation, the American subsidiary of IG Farben, which was later renamed General Aniline and Film Corporation. The directors of this American company included some of Wall Street's most prominent figures. The chairman of the American subsidiary was Hermann Schmitz himself. The connections ran so deep and were so intertwined that by the time America entered the war in December 1941, Sutton's conclusion was stark and unambiguous. Without the capital supplied by Wall Street, there would have been no IG Farben. And without IG Farben, there may well have been no Adolf Hitler and no Second World War, but IG Farben was only one thread in this story. To follow the money fully, you have to look at what was happening simultaneously in a different corner of the financial world. In the banking houses of Brown Brothers Harriman on Wall Street, where a quiet, respectable investment banker named Prescott Bush was going about his business. Prescott Bush was, by all accounts, a man of considerable personal rectitude. He was tall and handsome, a former Yale man and Skull and Bones member, a gifted golfer who served as president of the United States Golf Association. He would go on to serve Connecticut as a United States Senator from 1952 to 1963. Two of his descendants would become President of the United States. He was, in the language of his world, a pillar of the establishment. He was also a director of the Union Banking Corporation, a New York investment bank that functioned as a financial clearinghouse for the empire of Fritz Thyssen, a German steel and coal baron who was one of Adolf Hitler's earliest and most important financial backers. Thyssen had been personally funding Hitler since the mid-1920s. He attended Nazi rallies. He gave speeches endorsing the Nazi cause. He wrote, decades later, a memoir with the self-explanatory title, I Paid Hitler. And the financial pipeline through which a portion of this money flowed ran directly through the Union Banking Corporation, the bank that Prescott Bush directed from its New York offices. Brown Brothers Harriman, the private banking firm where Bush was a partner, acted as the American base for Thyssen's international financial operations. The Union Banking Corporation moved funds, bonds, gold, coal, oil, and steel between the United States and Germany throughout the Nazi military buildup. Thyssen owned the largest steel and coal company in Germany and grew substantially richer as Hitler poured money into rearmament. The steel that went into Nazi tanks and naval vessels and artillery pieces was, in part, the product of an empire that had been financially supported by a Wall Street firm run by the grandfather of two American presidents. On October 20th, 1942, nearly a year after the United States had entered the war against Germany, the United States government seized the assets of the Union Banking Corporation under the Trading with the Enemy Act. On the same day, it seized related entities including the Holland American Trading Corporation and the Seamless Steel Equipment Corporation. A month later, the government seized the Silesian American Corporation, which Bush directed alongside his father-in-law, George Herbert Walker, and which controlled large coal and zinc mines in Poland, including properties in the same district as Auschwitz. The seizure orders described these as enterprises that had continued to function under Nazi regime control and had been used to support the German war effort. The government had, in legal terms, confirmed that Prescott Bush had been running companies that were instruments of the enemy. John Loftus, a former prosecutor at the United States Department of Justice who specialized in Nazi war crimes cases and spent years working through declassified government files, was blunt in his assessment. He argued that what Prescott Bush had done constituted aid and comfort to the enemy and should have been grounds for prosecution. It never happened. Bush returned his company's seized assets after the war, received a modest settlement, and went on to win a Senate seat and raise a family that would occupy the White House for 12 of the most consequential years in American history. The government, as one historian observed, quietly smothered the story. The reason it was smothered tells you everything you need to know about who actually held power in America and where the true lines of accountability ran. Charles Hyam, a former New York Times reporter who broke much of this story in his 1983 book, Trading with the Enemy, The Nazi-American Money Plot, found evidence that senior officials in Washington had known throughout the war that prominent American corporations and financiers were maintaining business relationships with the enemy. They chose not to prosecute because, in the words attributed to some of these officials, a public scandal would have been devastating to morale, would have caused strikes, and would have made it impossible to use the corporate boards of these same companies to organize the American war effort. In other words, the people who were funding both sides of the war were too important to hold accountable. This logic, applied consistently and quietly, meant that roughly 150 representatives of 150 separate American companies who remained in Nazi Germany during the war, providing aid, maintaining business operations, collaborating with the regime, faced no prosecution. Not one of them. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented history that was declassified and confirmed through government archives. The people who should have been in the Nuremberg dock alongside the generals and the ideologues were instead hosting lunches at their clubs and managing their portfolios. The Ford Motor Company story runs parallel to all of this, but with an additional dimension that makes it uniquely disturbing. This is not merely a story about money. This is a story about ideas, about how a rich American's hatred traveled across the Atlantic and helped shape the mind of the most destructive human being of the 20th century. Henry Ford was one of the most celebrated men in America. He had invented the moving assembly line, democratized automobile ownership, and transformed industrial production in ways that genuinely improved millions of lives. He was also a virulent anti-Semite who used his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, to publish a series of articles under the title The International Jew, blaming Jewish people for everything from the Russian Revolution to the rise of organized crime to the corruption of American culture. These articles were later compiled into book form and translated into 16 languages. In Germany, they were a sensation. Adolf Hitler read The International Jew. He kept a portrait of Henry Ford in his private office in Munich. He described Ford admiringly in Mein Kampf. In fact, Ford is the only American mentioned by name in that book. In a 1931 interview with a reporter from the Detroit News, Hitler was asked about the Ford portrait on his wall. His answer was direct. He regarded Henry Ford as his inspiration. The youth leader of the Nazi Party, Baldur von Schirach, testified at Nuremberg that the decisive anti-Semitic book he had read as a young man, the book that had radicalized him, was Ford's The International Jew. Ford's Cologne automobile plant had been operating in Germany since the 1920s. By the start of the war, Ford's interests in Germany were valued at approximately $8.5 million. When Germany went to war, the Ford work plant in Cologne shifted to war production. It manufactured military vehicles, trucks, and other equipment for the Nazi war machine. Some of this work was carried out using forced labor, workers brought from occupied territories and concentration camps. After the Allied liberation of the Ford plants in Cologne and Berlin, United States Army investigators found conditions that they described as deeply disturbing. One post-war Army investigation concluded that the Ford plant had become what it called an arsenal of Nazism. Despite this, Ford faced no prosecution, no accountability, no reckoning of any real consequence. In 1938, on Ford's 75th birthday, Adolf Hitler presented him with the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. It was the highest medal the German government could bestow on a foreign citizen. Ford accepted it. He never returned it. Not after the November 1938 pogroms. Not after the German declaration of war on the United States in December 1941. He kept the medal. While Ford's contribution was partly ideological and partly industrial, the contribution of Standard Oil of New Jersey, the company that had grown from the wreckage of John Rockefeller's dissolved trust, was almost entirely operational. And it was, in the judgment of many historians, absolutely critical to the German military's ability to fight a war at all. Germany had a fundamental strategic problem that threatened to make any serious military campaign impossible. It had very limited domestic oil production. The internal combustion engines that powered the Wehrmacht's tanks, the Luftwaffe's aircraft, and the Kriegsmarine submarines all ran on petroleum products that Germany could not produce in sufficient quantities from its own resources. The solution to this problem was synthetic fuel, oil manufactured from coal through a process called hydrogenation, and the technology that made industrial-scale synthetic fuel production possible had been developed, refined, and licensed in partnership with Standard Oil of New Jersey. Standard Oil and IG Farben had in 1929 formed a cartel arrangement through a series of agreements that granted Standard Oil certain licensing rights in exchange for giving IG Farben access to Standard Oil's rubber technology. Through this arrangement, Standard Oil provided Germany with crucial technical knowledge about the hydrogenation process. A United States Senate investigation in 1942 found that Standard Oil's agreements with IG Farben had, in effect, retarded American rubber and oil development while simultaneously advancing the German war industry's capacity. Senator Harry Truman, who led this investigation, was furious. He described the Standard Farben agreements as approaching treason. In 1939, 6 months before Hitler invaded Poland and officially began the Second World War, Chase National Bank, which was part of the Rockefeller financial empire, transferred $25 million to Germany. When Germany occupied France in 1940 and most American businesses left Paris, Chase kept its French branches open and did business with and for the Nazi occupiers. This included actions that ranged from seizing the accounts of Jewish customers to, according to documented accounts, providing financial services to the Gestapo. Carlos Niederman, the chief of Chase's Paris branch, wrote his supervisors in Manhattan that the bank enjoyed very special esteem with top German officials and a rapid expansion of deposits. This letter was written in May 1942. 5 months after Pearl Harbor, 5 months after the United States went to war with Germany. And then there is IBM. This is perhaps the most technically precise of all these relationships, and in some ways, the most chilling, because what International Business Machines Corporation provided to the Nazi regime was not money or materials, but the organizational technology that made the Holocaust industrially efficient. Edwin Black documented this relationship exhaustively in his 2001 book, IBM and the Holocaust. The core finding was that IBM's punch card tabulation technology, which the company provided and maintained through its German subsidiary, and crucially, through direct involvement from IBM headquarters in New York, was used to organize, categorize, track, and process the populations that the Nazis sought to control and ultimately destroy. The numbering system used to tattoo inmates at concentration camps was, in fact, an IBM Hollerith punch card system identifier. IBM knew exactly what its technology was being used for. The company maintained technical service representatives in Germany who serviced the machines. IBM chairman Thomas Watson met personally with Hitler in 1937 and was awarded a Special Merit Cross by the German government. Like Ford, he accepted the award. Sitting above all of these individual corporate relationships was an institution that most people have never heard of, but which was the central nerve of the entire network. The Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, headquartered in Basel, Switzerland. The BIS had been established in 1930, ostensibly to facilitate the Dawes and Young Plan reparations payments. Its partners included the Reichsbank, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, and several Morgan-affiliated banks. When the war began, the BIS became what historians have described as Hitler's secret private wealth manager and money launderer. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, the Austrian national gold reserves were looted and transferred to Germany via the BIS. When Czechoslovakia was occupied, the BIS facilitated the transfer of 23 tons of Czechoslovak gold, worth £5.6 million, to the Reichsbank, even as Britain was moving toward declaring war on Germany. Nazi gold, including gold extracted from the victims of the Holocaust, dental fillings, jewelry, wedding rings, was laundered through BIS accounts. The director of the BIS throughout the entire war was a Wall Streeter named Thomas McKittrick. During the war, he traveled freely in Nazi territory, met with Reichsbank officials for regular business discussions, and was deemed so important to the financial architecture of both sides that in 1943, German U-boats received orders not to interfere with the ship carrying him back from Germany to New York for consultations. He came home when the war ended and was appointed vice president of Chase National Bank, the Rockefeller's institution, as a reward for services rendered. Now the war ends. Germany is in ruins. The Allied powers convene the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. The proceedings are historic. The principle is sound, that individuals bear criminal responsibility for crimes against humanity and cannot hide behind the orders of their state. The tribunal sentences 10 Nazi leaders to death by hanging. It sends a signal to the world that the rule of law applies even to the most powerful among us. And then comes the question of the industrialists. There were separate subsequent trials for the business executives. The Flick trial, the Krupp trial, and the IG Farben trial, which covered the chemical company that had manufactured Zyklon B, that had built a plant using slave labor at Auschwitz, and that had financed the Nazi seizure of power in 1933 with a 400,000 Reichsmark contribution to Hitler's political slush fund. 24 IG Farben directors stood trial. 10 of them were acquitted on all charges. The maximum sentence handed down was 8 years. And this went to the director who had personally overseen construction of the Auschwitz plant, who had commanded the Bunamonowitz concentration camp adjacent to that plant, and who had therefore personally overseen the working of tens of thousands of slave laborers, many of whom were systematically worked to death. 8 years. For personally commanding a concentration camp at Auschwitz. In the bitter words of the chief American prosecutor, Josiah Dubois, the sentences were light enough to please a chicken thief. And what about the American directors of IG Farben? What about the American affiliates of the company? What about the Wall Street bankers who had been on IG Farben's supervisory boards? In the words of Anthony Sutton's research, they were quietly forgotten. The truth was buried. The American affiliates and the American directors were not brought to trial at all. The prosecution at Nuremberg had explicitly argued that without the capital supplied by Wall Street, IG Farben could not have existed, and the Holocaust would likely not have been possible. But the Wall Street side of that equation was never placed before a court. Why? The answer, as with the trading with the enemy cases, comes back to the same cold logic of power protecting power. Professor Sutton spent years analyzing who controlled the post-war investigations into German industry and concluded that Wall Street firms managed the process from the top. The head of the finance division for the Allied Control Council in Germany was Louis Douglas, a director of the Morgan-controlled General Motors. The head of the economics division was William Draper, a partner in Dillon, Red, the very firm that had been so instrumental in financing Nazi Germany's industrial buildup in the first place. General Lucius Clay, the deputy military governor for Germany, appointed Draper to assemble his control team largely from businessmen who had represented American business interests in pre-war Germany. The people running the post-war investigation into German business collaboration were, in significant measure, former collaborators themselves. The IG Farben directors who did receive prison sentences were, almost without exception, free within a few years. Fritz Termeer, who had been sentenced to 7 years for his central role in deploying slave labor and his oversight of the Auschwitz plant, was released in 1950 after serving less than 4 years. By 1956, he had been appointed chairman of the supervisory board of Bayer, one of the successor companies carved out of the dismantled IG Farben empire. The men who had built the chemical architecture of the Holocaust resumed their careers in German industry with barely a pause. The American partners who had helped them build that empire in the first place had never even faced a courtroom. There is one more layer to this story that tends to be left out of even the more critical historical accounts, and it concerns what happened not at the end of the war but after it. In the months following Germany's surrender, American intelligence agencies operating under a classified program known as Operation Paperclip systematically recruited hundreds of German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists, many of them former Nazi Party members, some of them directly implicated in the crimes of the regime, and brought them to the United States. These were men who had worked in weapons programs, in rocket development, in chemical research. They were given new identities, clean paperwork, and jobs in American universities, defense contractors, and government agencies. The ideological screening that should have barred their entry was deliberately falsified or ignored. The argument made for this program was strategic. The Soviet Union was doing the same thing. The Cold War was beginning. The technical knowledge these men possessed was too valuable to allow it to fall into Soviet hands. And so a decision was made, again at the highest levels of the American national security establishment, that the crimes of the past were less important than the perceived needs of the present. Again, accountability was deferred. Again, the people whose decisions had the most direct impact on the scale and character of Nazi Germany's crimes were protected, absorbed, repurposed. 50 years after the Nuremberg trials, when the relevant documents began to be declassified and researchers began to piece together what had actually happened, the descendants of some of these men were running for President of the United States. The banks at the center of the story had merged and evolved and been rebranded and had grown during the second half of the 20th century into the largest and most powerful financial institutions in the world. The corporations, The oil companies, the chemical companies, the automobile manufacturers had continued to operate, had continued to grow, had become the pillars of the global capitalist order. None of them were called to account. None of them paid a price that was in any meaningful proportion to their role in the catastrophe. There is a phrase that comes up repeatedly in the accounts of people who investigated this history, and it is worth dwelling on. Charles Hyam documented that the government had determined a public scandal would have drastically affected morale and provoked mutinies in the armed services. Think about what that means. It means that the men fighting the war, the ordinary soldiers who were being killed in the Pacific and in Normandy and at the Battle of the Bulge, might have refused to fight if they had known that the companies back home were trading with the enemy that was killing them. The government was not protecting national security when it buried these stories. It was protecting the reputations and the assets of the financial class from the rage of the men they were sending to die. That is the true horror at the center of this story. Not just that Wall Street funded Hitler, though it did. Not just that American corporations traded with the enemy, though they did. But that the people who held the power to make these things visible chose instead to make them invisible, because they understood that true accountability, the kind that follows the money wherever it actually leads, would have required dismantling the very structures that gave them their power. The Third Reich fell. The people who financed it did not. Now, some of you will want to argue that this history is exaggerated, that the connections are overstated, that the businessmen were naive or ignorant rather than complicit. These are fair points to consider. And it is true that Sutton and some of the others who worked in this area were pushing against the grain of mainstream academic history, and that some of their specific claims require verification against primary sources. It is also true that the Dawes Plan, whatever its consequences, was genuinely designed by people who believed they were solving a real problem of European instability. Not everyone who invested in Weimar Germany was doing so with the knowledge or intention of helping the Nazi Party. But the documented core of this story, the IG Farben connection, the Prescott Bush and Union Banking Corporation case, the Chase Paris branch, the Standard Oil cartel with Farben, Henry Ford's ideological contribution and his industrial plants, the Bank for International Settlements, the management of the post-war investigations by people with direct business ties to the defendants. This core is not conjecture. It is supported by declassified government documents, by Senate investigation records, by corporate archives, by court testimony at Nuremberg, by academic historians at major universities. The question is not whether it happened. The question is why it has been treated as a footnote rather than as a central chapter in the history of the war. And the answer to that question tells you something important about how history is written and by whom, and about their relationship between financial power and the stories that a society tells about itself. The winners write the history, as the saying goes. But in the case of the Second World War, some of the real winners, the financial interests that profited from both sides and survived the conflict with their power and their wealth substantially intact, had every incentive to ensure that the history written about them was the incomplete version, and they had the resources and the connections to make that happen. The men who funded the rise of Hitler understood something very simple about power. They understood that in a world where money is the prerequisite for everything else, for politics, for military force, for the ability to prosecute a war, the people who control the money occupy a position that is, in practice, above accountability, not because the law does not technically apply to them, but because the law in practice is applied by people who need them too much to apply it fully. The Nuremberg trials established that there is no such thing as immunity from human justice. That is a genuine and important legacy. But what happened in the years and decades before and after those trials established something else, that the principle of accountability has edges, and that those edges are defined not by the law but by power. And power, in the modern world, runs through finance. That is the real lesson of this story. Not that evil men did terrible things, we know that, but that evil was financed, that the financing was organized, and that the organization of evil escaped justice, not because it was hidden well enough, but because the people responsible for administering justice decided that some things were too important to pursue to their true conclusion. They made that decision quietly, in offices and committee rooms, without headlines or announcements. And the world moved on, and the money kept flowing, and the names above the doors of the banks changed, but the institutions remained, and the families remained, and the power remained. The war was won, the peace was managed, and the financiers went home. If you've made it all the way to the end of this, I want you to drop a $sign in the comments. I want to see how many of you stayed through the whole thing. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I genuinely appreciate it. We cover these kinds of stories, the ones that exist in the documented historical record but never quite make it into the mainstream conversation. And the only way we can keep doing that is if you stay with us. Check out the video on the Dutch East India Company if you haven't already. I think you'll find it connects to a lot of what we talked about today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.